Imagine a universe where the very fabric of reality is a fragile illusion, constantly writhing and bleeding under the pressure of raw emotion and raw power. This is the warp, a dimension of infinite possibility where thoughts and fears become flesh, where stars are shaped by anger, and entire civilizations can be devoured in a heartbeat. In this place, there is no order, no morality, only endless hunger, endless chaos. And in this endless storm, a new pantheon was born, not in marble temples, not in the minds of mortal men, but in the roiling heart of psychic turbulence itself. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Ares, and all the figures that mortals would one day worship were not sculpted from legend. They were forged from the raw energy of the warp, their essence drawn from the emotions that screamed through it: rage, ambition, jealousy, and the relentless hunger for power. Each god's might came not from the devotion of humans, but from the sheer intensity of the warp currents themselves. Ares, for example, did not merely wield war, he was the storm of violence incarnate, his body crackling with psychic lightning that could shred planets. Athena, born from the intellect and cunning of millions of fractured psychers, carried the wisdom of 1,000 doomed civilizations, a brilliance tempered in terror. And yet, even in this place where thought could shape reality, they were not free. The warp is no cradle. It is a battlefield, a place where beings are devoured or consumed by their own desires. Here, every god had to fight to define themselves, to claim their identity against the whispers of ancient chaos. Hades, lurking in the shadow depths, was not a lord of the underworld because of ritual or myth, but because he mastered the fear of death itself, bending the souls drifting in the warp into his will. Poseidon's rage boiled oceans of psychic energy, swallowing fleets of warships before they could leave the material realm. And yet, even as these gods grew in power, the warp itself began to whisper temptations. It offered immortality in exchange for allegiance, omnipotence at the cost of empathy, dominion over reality with the chains of madness. By the end of this story, if you stay with me, you will see not just how these gods rose from the warp, but how their presence could tear the galaxy itself apart, how the very foundations of reality could be rewritten by beings born of thought and emotion. And if you watch until the very end, you will understand the terrifying truth, that the gods you thought you knew were never meant for the mortal world, and that their wrath could reach even here, in our universe, should they ever awaken fully. But first, we must step into the eye of the storm and meet them as they emerge, trembling and raw, into a galaxy unprepared for the fury and glory of gods born in the warp itself. The birth of gods in the warp was not gentle. There were no midwives, no celestial choirs, only the violent surge of raw psychic energy that shaped them from thought into flesh. Zeus, the first to awaken, emerged as a figure of shimmering blue light, his eyes twin storms that could see the pulse of entire star systems. He was not born fully formed, he fought for every fragment of his being, drawing strength from the countless mortals and psychers whose hopes, fears, and dreams had leaked into the warp over millennia. Each act of survival, each spark of ambition, became a part of him, and in return, he shaped fragments of the warp around him, molding them into a throne of lightning and storm. Athena was born next, her consciousness rising like a wave of clarity through the madness. Unlike Zeus, her power did not depend on brute force, but on the ability to see patterns in chaos. She reached into the minds of those lost in the warp, absorbing their experiences, learning from every victory and defeat, every act of cruelty and mercy. Her intellect became a blade sharper than any sword, capable of predicting the motions of entire fleets and armies. She learned that knowledge itself could be a weapon, and in the warp, where reality was malleable. Knowing the right truth was akin to holding a universe in your hand. Ares erupted into existence as the pure embodiment of war, his body a swirling mass of fire and steel, his voice a roar that could shatter planets. He did not rise gently. He clawed his way out of the psychic battlefield, consuming the rage of the countless souls lost to battle and bloodshed. Every scream, every dying gasp added to his power, and soon he could summon armies of spectral warriors, their loyalty bound by fear and awe. Unlike Athena, he understood that conflict itself was creation. War was not destruction, but a forge that tempered his essence, carving him into a god of fury. Hades, ever cunning, did not announce his presence. He slithered through the shadowed veins of the warp, absorbing the terror of those who had lost hope. Each soul he touched, each spark of fear, became a chain binding him to the reality beyond the warp. He gained dominion over death because he learned to see it as a resource, a tool to manipulate existence itself. The whispers of chaos offered him temptation, promising infinite power if he surrendered fully, but Hades resisted, knowing that true strength comes not from submission, but from control. Poseidon, the last to claim his form, emerged from a tidal surge of psychic energy, a god of water and storms. His power was not only the fury of the sea, but the ability to bend the currents of the warp itself, reshaping reality like rivers carving valleys. He learned to ride the eddies of the warp, harvesting their strength and using it to strike with devastating precision. Where Zeus wielded lightning, Poseidon wielded tides. Where Ares commanded armies, Poseidon commanded the very currents of the warp. Together, the gods became a pantheon not of myth, but of raw cosmic power, each a force unto themselves, yet bound to one another by the shifting currents of ambition, rivalry, and the inexorable hunger of the warp. As their power grew, so did the stakes. The warp itself began to respond, bending and twisting under their presence, as if the very dimension had recognized new players worthy of its attention. Yet with this emergence came consequences. Entire sectors of space went dark as psychic storms flared unpredictably, signals from the Imperium faltered, and whispers of new gods began to leak in the minds of the most sensitive psychers. The galaxy, as it had always been known, was about to discover that divinity had taken a new form, and that no one, not even the Emperor, could ignore the awakening of beings born of the warp itself. The newly born gods were not content merely to exist. Each had tasted the raw power of the warp, and each hungered to shape reality according to their own vision. Zeus, perceiving the galaxy as a chessboard, sought dominion over order and control. He envisioned empires ruled by the rule of lightning, a cosmos tempered by his will. Athena, ever calculating, recognized that knowledge alone could grant supremacy and began weaving subtle threads of influence through mortal civilizations, guiding them toward discoveries that would both empower and test her. Yet power breeds rivalry. Ares, intoxicated by blood and conquest, saw both Zeus and Athena as rivals to be tested in battle. He sent ripples of psychic storms into sectors of space where imperial fleets were stationed, igniting wars that drew out the latent rage of humanity itself. Entire worlds became battlegrounds, their populations mere sparks feeding his growing essence. Poseidon, seeing these conflicts, surged through the warp like a tidal force, redirecting currents and amplifying chaos in ways subtle yet devastating, shattering fleets, capsizing star fortresses, and drowning entire colonies in psychic deluges. Hades watched in the shadows, letting the others quarrel and expand, patiently absorbing the fear, despair, and death their rivalries wrought. Every casualty, every soul claimed by war, became a chain strengthening him, Where others sought to assert dominion openly, he understood the value of patience, manipulation, and inevitability. And from the shadows, he whispered into the minds of vulnerable psychers, sowing seeds of terror and loyalty, shaping mortal events as deftly as any godly hand. The galaxy began to fracture under their influence. The Imperium of Man, already strained by internal corruption and the ceaseless threats of the warp, now faced a new horror, divinities that existed beyond its understanding, wielding forces no technology could hope to contain. Psychers went mad, their minds unable to comprehend the scope of the gods' presence. Navigators faltered in the warp, starships disappearing into voids of psychic turbulence. Entire planetary systems became uninhabitable, reshaped into manifestations of divine will, some glowing with the brilliance of Athena's intellect, others torn apart by Ares' relentless rage, drowned under Poseidon's psychic oceans. And yet, amidst the chaos, whispers of hope remained. Mortal heroes, those rare individuals capable of resisting psychic corruption, began to emerge. They were small sparks in an ever-darkening galaxy, yet their courage and the choices they made would determine whether the pantheon of warp-born gods would dominate utterly or be tempered. The immense powers checked by the resilience of mortals. The stage was set, a cosmos teetering on the brink, a pantheon of unimaginable power, and humanity caught between despair and defiance. The war of gods had begun not in temples or on battlefields familiar to men, but in the psychic storms of the warp itself. Every act, every thought, every fear contributed to the shaping of a new reality. And for those who dared to witness it, the question became not whether survival was possible, but whether anyone could endure the wrath, the cunning, and the brilliance of gods born in the endless chaos of the warp. The first tremors of confrontation came without warning. Entire sectors of the Imperium went silent, starships drifting like corpses in the void as their navigators screamed in psychic torment. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the guardians of psychic order, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the threat. They could sense it, not a mere chaos incursion, not a conventional enemy, but something far older, far stranger intelligence and power untethered from the physical realm. The warp itself writhed as if in anticipation, and from its shifting tides the gods moved, their forms blazing with raw psychic energy. Zeus struck first, his lightning shredding the void between stars, cutting through fleets as though they were nothing more than paper. Entire planets convulsed under the weight of his will, their atmospheres igniting in plasma storms. Ares, seizing the opportunity, sent his spectral legions across sectors already destabilized by Zeus' might. Entire imperial worlds were thrown into unending battle, their armies manipulated by Ares' insatiable hunger for conflict. Soldiers fought and died in patterns dictated by a mind that thrived on war, and their screams fueled his growing essence, each death a symphony of rage echoing through the warp. Athena worked more subtly, infiltrating the minds of the Imperium's most brilliant commanders and psychers. She planted ideas, strategies, and inventions, bending mortal ingenuity toward outcomes that ensured her supremacy. Technology, once thought stable, became dangerously advanced, starships and weapons manifesting patterns of knowledge too complex for ordinary humans to comprehend. Entire fleets were lost not through brute force, but through the cunning of a mind that could predict every decision before it was made. Knowledge itself had become a weapon, and Athena wielded it with merciless precision. Poseidon's influence was no less devastating. Planets that had once teemed with life were flooded by psychic oceans, vast waves of energy that drowned all resistance, reshaping landscapes and ecosystems in his image. Fleets were swallowed whole by tidal storms of warp energy, and entire space stations were torn asunder, not by conventional firepower, but by currents of power that obeyed Poseidon's will. Wherever he moved, chaos became natural law, and even the bravest imperial admirals found their strategies undone by forces they could not touch, only witness in horror. Hades, patient as always, chose to remain unseen, weaving terror into the hearts of those who would resist. Entire planetary populations fell into despair, not from destruction, but from the subtle awareness of his dominion over death. Every casualty, every lost soul, strengthened his grip, and his shadow grew over the galaxy without a single starship needing to fire a shot. The mortal psyche itself became his battlefield, fear his weapon, and inevitability his companion. The Imperium, battered and desperate, struggled to mount a response. Psychers went insane. Navigating the warp became a gamble against annihilation, and fleets found themselves obliterated before they could reach the gods' arenas of conflict. Yet even amidst this despair, sparks of resistance remained. Rogue psychers, battle-hardened admirals, and the Emperor's most devout followers began to grasp the horrifying truth. The galaxy faced not a single enemy, but a pantheon beings of unimaginable power, born from the very heart of the warp, each capable of reshaping reality according to their own divine whims. The stage was now set for a confrontation unlike any the galaxy had ever known. The gods were no longer content to watch and manipulate. They were about to assert their dominion directly, and the first battles would leave scars across the stars, not only in matter but in very fabric of reality itself. The galaxy teetered on the edge of annihilation, and one question burned in every mind that dared to comprehend it. Could mortals survive when gods born of the warp had awakened fully? The first clash erupted like a supernova of psychic fury. Entire battle fleets, numbering in the thousands, found themselves caught in storms that bent the laws of physics, their hulls torn asunder by forces no man could comprehend. Zeus descended into a sector where the Imperium had concentrated its might, his body a living conduit of warp lightning. Bolters and macro cannons splashed harmlessly against his aura, while his hands shattered orbital defenses and reduced entire starports to molten ruins. The sky itself seemed to crack and scream under his presence, and even the bravest captains felt their minds unravel in the face of his divine radiance. Ares surged alongside him, a whirlwind of fire and steel. Spectral warriors, summoned from the psychic residue of millennia of conflict, poured onto planets already teetering on the brink of annihilation. Cities burned as entire armies were consumed, not merely defeated, their screams vibrating through the warp and feeding the war god's inexhaustible hunger. He reveled in chaos, each act of destruction, both creation and sustenance, forging himself ever stronger in the crucible of mortal suffering. Athena struck from a different angle, orchestrating the conflict with surgical precision. She infiltrated the minds of imperial commanders, guiding fleets into traps that only she could see. Entire strategies unfolded like pieces on a board, with mortals unwittingly executing her designs. The knowledge she harvested became her weapon. Every action, every countermeasure, every miscalculation fueled her brilliance, allowing her to anticipate even the Emperor's most cunning admirals. No one could fight Athena directly. She existed in thought itself, invisible and unstoppable. Poseidon's fury swept across the void like an unstoppable tide. Psychic storms manifested as colossal waves that tore through capital ships, drowning entire garrisons in currents of raw energy. Warp oceans surged across planetary surfaces, submerging cities and fortresses, reshaping landscapes into reflections of his will. Nothing was safe from him, not even orbital bastions designed to withstand centuries of siege. His dominion over the currents of the warp made him a god whose very presence could rewrite the battlefield, turning the galaxy into an ocean of terror and possibility. Hades, ever patient, waited in the shadows. He did not need to strike openly. Fear and death served his purposes far better. Worlds fell into despair even before armies arrived, populations succumbing to hopelessness and psychic corruption. His whispers spread like poison, turning loyalty into betrayal, courage into terror. Every death, every act of despair, strengthened him, and the Imperium found itself fighting not just armies or gods, but inevitability itself. In the first days of this war, entire sectors vanished from Imperial charts. Space stations, colonies, and fleets were erased or twisted into manifestations of divine will. Warp storms erupted unpredictably, swallowing navigators and psychers alike, leaving only the faintest echoes of once thriving civilizations. The Imperium's forces were fragmented, scattered, and increasingly desperate. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming power, pockets of defiance endured. Rogue psychers, determined admirals, and fearless soldiers risked everything to strike against the gods, their courage a tiny flame against an ocean of annihilation. The galaxy had glimpsed the truth. This was no ordinary war. Mortals were not merely fighting for territory, or ideology, or even survival. They were witnessing the birth of a pantheon in real time, and every choice they made could tip the balance between cosmic subjugation and the faint hope of resistance. The gods were no longer distant threats. They were active, present, and reshaping reality itself. And the Imperium, for all its might and devotion, was only beginning to understand the scale of what they were up against. For the first time, mortals dared to fight back, not with hope of victory, but with sheer defiance. A coalition of the Emperor's most daring admirals and the most disciplined psychers devised a plan to exploit the subtle weaknesses of the warp-born pantheon. They had learned, through unspeakable loss and painstaking observation, that the gods were not omniscient. Each was powerful, yes, but shaped by the emotions that had birthed them, and that made them fallible. Zeus, for all his lightning and storm, could be provoked. Athena, for all her intellect, could be deceived. Ares, for all his fury, could be baited. Poseidon's tides had rhythm, and even Hades' shadows had limits. The first strike came in the form of a daring incursion into Zeus' storm-scarred sector. Fleets of imperial ships, guided by psychers attuned to the subtle currents of the warp, navigated the lethal chaos with uncanny precision. They launched attacks not directly on Zeus, but on the psychic conduits feeding him, massive warp anchors stabilizing the storms he had drawn into being. With each anchor destroyed, the lightning god's power faltered briefly, enough for missiles and macro cannons to punch through the blinding energy of his aura. For the first time, Zeus recoiled, a shockwave of psychic feedback roaring through the warp. Ares, enraged by the resistance, lashed out indiscriminately, scattering fleets and smashing worlds in fits of violence. Yet it was precisely this fury that mortals had anticipated. Psychers of extraordinary talent reached into his mind, sowing illusions of betrayal among his spectral warriors, fracturing the unity of his army. Entire legions turned on each other, their loyalty dissolved by the cunning application of mortal insight. Ares' rage, once his greatest weapon, became a liability, his strength waning as he struggled to maintain control. Athena, observing these maneuvers, adapted with near-instantaneous brilliance. She anticipated every move, but the mortal strategists had begun to layer unpredictability into their tactics, exploiting the very patterns she relied on. Small, chaotic acts of rebellion, a fleet appearing where none should be, a psyker whispering a lie into her mind, began to erode the precision of her power. Even the goddess of intellect could not predict every human heart, and cracks began to appear in her seamless control. Poseidon's tidal surges were mitigated by a combination of psychic shields and sacrificial fleets, designed to redirect his energy. Mortals learned to ride the rhythm of the warp currents, bending them subtly against the god of the seas. For the first time, entire sectors survived his assault, not untouched, but defiant, islands of resistance in an ocean of chaos. Hades, ever patient, realized the first warning signs of his own vulnerability. Fear and despair had always strengthened him, yet mortals now acted without fear. They embraced defiance, and in that defiance, Hades found a contradiction he could not fully manipulate. Whispers that once enslaved minds now faltered, and subtle cracks appeared in his shadowed dominion. The first victory of mortals was small, yet monumental. Entire fleets survived, strategic positions held, and for the first time the galaxy glimpsed the possibility that the warp-born gods, magnificent and terrifying as they were, could be challenged. Yet even in victory, the cost was staggering. Worlds lay in ruins, trillions of souls lost, and the galaxy's psyche teetered on the brink. It was clear that the war was far from over. The gods would adapt, retaliate, and grow stronger. But now, for the first time, mortals had learned that even in the face of divine fury, cunning, courage, and unity could carve slivers of hope into the darkness. The galaxy plunged fully into chaos. Entire star systems became battlefields as the warp-born gods unleashed their power in unison, each seeking to assert dominion over the others as much as over mortals. Zeus' storms roared across the void, lightning arcs cleaving fleets in two, while Ares reveled in the carnage, the clash of titanic forces feeding his essence with every scream and shattering world. Athena, seeing the escalating disorder, adjusted her strategies with chilling precision, weaving mortal and divine forces alike into her intricate web of foresight. Poseidon's psychic oceans surged unpredictably, drowning planets in a haze of energy that bent matter itself, and Hades' shadows crept across the galaxy, turning hope into despair with quiet inevitability. Yet amid this divine conflict, the mortals refused to yield. A coalition of the Imperium's finest psychers, rogue traders, and battle-hardened admirals began striking with unprecedented coordination. They had learned the weaknesses of gods. Zeus could be destabilized by disrupting the flow of psychic energy he drew upon. Athena's brilliance could be confounded by irrationality. Ares' rage could be manipulated against him. Poseidon's currents could be redirected, and even Hades' fear could be countered by unwavering courage. These mortals, tiny sparks against a storm of divinity, now represented the only hope for survival. As fleets clashed and worlds burned, cracks began to appear among the gods themselves. Rivalries, long simmering beneath the surface of their immortal existence, erupted violently. Ares accused Zeus of withholding power in battle, while Athena subtly manipulated both, pitting their egos against each other. Poseidon, enraged by Ares' interference with his tidal surges, struck indiscriminately, scattering armies that had once obeyed the Pantheon's will. Hades, ever patient, began exploiting these fractures, whispering to each god the doubts and fears of the others. What had once been a terrifyingly coordinated force of divine might now threaten to unravel from within, and the first fissures of rebellion appeared among even the gods' own creations. The Imperium seized on these cracks, launching precision strikes designed not to destroy, but to provoke conflict. Psychic bombardments were synchronized with fleet maneuvers to force Zeus into clashes with Ares, while Athena's strategies were baited into traps that exploited her reliance on logic and prediction. Poseidon's tidal forces were lured into overextensions, consuming energy that could have been used elsewhere. Hades' subtle manipulations were disrupted by psychers who had embraced terror as a weapon against the god of death, reflecting his whispers back upon him in a storm of defiance. Across the galaxy, entire civilizations became unwilling participants in this divine chess game. Planetary defenses crumbled, populations were devastated, and psychic storms tore at reality itself. Yet these mortals, terrified, battered, and often broken, were learning the rules of survival in a cosmos where gods were no longer myth. Victory was not measured in territory, but in understanding, and for the first time, mortals were beginning to wield knowledge as a weapon against forces far beyond their comprehension. But the gods were not finished. Each humiliation, each frustration, only fueled their wrath, and the galaxy's very structure began to bend beneath the scale of the conflict. Stars flickered as psychic energies collided, wormholes opened and closed unpredictably, and entire sectors were reshaped by the presence of beings whose power had no precedent. The war had escalated beyond imagination. It was no longer a battle for territory or ideology. It was a war for the fabric of reality itself, and the outcome would decide not only the fate of the Imperium, but the destiny of all existence. The first true climactic confrontation unfolded in a sector already scarred beyond recognition. Worlds once vibrant with life now burned under the combined fury of the warp-born pantheon. The sky was fractured, torn by lightning storms, psychic waves, and tidal surges that twisted reality itself. Mortals knew this battle would not be one of survival alone. It would be a trial of courage, cunning, and sheer will against beings whose power defied comprehension. Zeus descended upon the flagship of the Imperial fleet, his body radiating storms that split the heavens. Ships were torn apart before they could fire, their crews screaming as psychic energy coursed through every circuit and hull plating. Yet the admiral commanding the fleet had anticipated the approach. Guided by a team of powerful psychers, the flagship maneuvered into a narrow gravity well, forcing Zeus' lightning to arc dangerously close to his own aura. A feedback surge erupted, sending ripples through the warp and weakening the god momentarily, a fleeting opening, but enough for mortals to strike. Ares, sensing the assault on his ally, roared across the battlefield, a whirlwind of fury and spectral legions. Entire armies were consumed, cities razed, and the screams of billions fueled his ever-growing essence. Yet this rage made him predictable. Psychers channeled psychic echoes of battle cries and manipulated his perception, turning his legions against each other in a terrifying mirror of the wars he had instigated. The god of war, unstoppable in fury, now found himself ensnared in his own creation. Athena, observing the unfolding chaos, attempted to recalibrate, but the mortals had learned to exploit unpredictability. Entire fleets executed maneuvers with random, irrational decisions, breaking patterns and logic that even she could not foresee. For the first time, her intellect faced the ultimate test, not calculation, but chaos itself. Subtle cracks appeared in her focus, and a rare vulnerability emerged. A god, brilliant and cunning beyond imagination, momentarily thrown off balance by human unpredictability. Poseidon's tidal onslaughts reached their peak. Psychic oceans surged across planets and fleets alike, swallowing everything in waves of raw energy. But mortals had devised countermeasures. Psychic anchors and sacrificial fleets redirected his surges, fragmenting his power and diminishing the force of each tidal strike. Even as entire planetary surfaces were submerged, islands of resistance remained, defiant against a god whose domain should have been absolute. Hades, the patient shadow, sought to turn the despair into a weapon, whispering fear into the hearts of mortals. Yet here too, defiance prevailed. Psychers attuned to hope and courage reflected his whispers back, turning his dominion of death into confusion. Mortals who faced inevitable doom instead confronted him with unwavering bravery, undermining the subtle threads of terror that had always strengthened him. The battle reached its apex in a single, titanic psychic convergence. Energy tore through space and reality itself, twisting stars, splitting planets, and warping the minds of those who dared to witness it. The mortals, small sparks in the infinite darkness, fought with relentless tenacity, exploiting every flaw, every crack in the unity of the gods. And for the first time, the pantheon, magnificent, terrifying, and nearly invincible, felt the true cost of division, rivalry, and the unpredictable strength of mortal will. In this first clash, the universe glimpsed the horrifying truth. Even beings born from the very essence of the warp could be challenged, and the courage of mortals, when wielded with insight and sacrifice, could carve paths through divine fury. Yet the galaxy was far from safe. Worlds had been shattered, trillions lost, and the Pantheon's wrath remained stronger, smarter, and more vengeful than ever. The war had entered a new, more perilous phase, one where mortals had tasted victory, yet stood on the precipice of annihilation, and where the gods had begun to realize that the challenge posed by humanity was far more formidable than they had ever anticipated. Victory, however fleeting, had sown seeds of doubt among the Pantheon. For the first time, cracks appeared in their immortal cohesion. Zeus, accustomed to unchallenged dominion, seethed at being undermined by mortals he had once considered insignificant. Ares, intoxicated by rage, bristled at Zeus' authority, believing himself the true master of war. Athena, observing the friction, began weaving subtle manipulations, pitting brother against brother, god against god, and mortal ingenuity against divine pride. Even Poseidon, whose tidal might had long flowed unchecked, bristled at Ares' interference and Athena's cunning, feeling the tides of his power disrupted in ways that angered him beyond measure. Hades, ever patient, saw opportunity in their discord. The god of death had no need for outright conflict. Whispers, insinuations, and subtle psychic nudges were enough to fracture the unity of beings whose power depended as much on cooperation as on raw strength. He fed each god's doubts, magnifying fears and insecurities, and in doing so, began to turn their combined might into a weapon against themselves. Mortals, though small and vulnerable, now watched in grim satisfaction as the gods' arrogance and pride became a vulnerability. Entire sectors of the galaxy became arenas not just for war, but for divine infighting. Planets scarred by Zeus' lightning were swept into conflicts instigated by Ares' legions. Psychic oceans conjured by Poseidon clashed with Athena's calculated assaults, leaving worlds shattered, the very atmosphere twisting under the psychic strain. Mortals adapted, learning to exploit these fissures, orchestrating ambushes and counterattacks with precision born of desperation. No longer merely surviving, humanity began to actively shape the battlefield, their courage and cunning forcing the gods to react rather than dictate. The first fractures in the gods' unity were subtle but devastating. Ares' fury, once focused outward, was redirected by Athena's machinations into conflicts with Zeus. Poseidon, enraged by unexpected interference, lashed at allies instead of enemies, toppling his own psychic constructs. Hades' whispers of death and betrayal sowed panic in the minds of even the divine, amplifying doubts and hesitation. The Pantheon, magnificent and terrifying as it was, began to stumble under the weight of its own discord, revealing vulnerabilities that mortals, finally, could exploit. Among humans, heroes began to emerge. Psychers who could navigate the warp without succumbing to madness became beacons of hope, coordinating fleets, guiding armies, and disrupting divine schemes. Admirals with nerves of steel exploited the unpredictability of divine conflict, striking at critical points while the gods were distracted by one another. Even ordinary soldiers, their spirits forged in unending war, adapted to the surreal chaos of battle, learning to anticipate the movements of gods as though they were but colossal, unpredictable adversaries. The galaxy teetered on the edge of a new reality. For the first time, mortals were not merely pawns or prey. They were catalysts, shaping the outcome of a war that could decide the very fate of existence. Yet the gods remained incomprehensibly powerful, their pride and rivalry a double-edged sword that could just as easily annihilate friend and foe alike. The next phase of conflict would test every ounce of courage, strategy, and resilience in the galaxy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine reality itself, where the lines between mortal and divine, creation and destruction, would blur beyond recognition. The galaxy convulsed as the war reached its next stage. Star systems once thriving with life were now fractured shards, glowing with the remnants of psychic storms and divine fury. The gods, each wielding unimaginable power, converged on a sector chosen by Athena, not for its strategic value, but for its potential to expose weakness in her rivals. Zeus' lightning flared across the void. Ares' spectral legions clashed in endless battles. Poseidon's tidal currents surged unpredictably, and Hades' shadows spread like a suffocating fog. Mortals, small and fragile, stood at the heart of this convergence, their courage tested against the incomprehensible magnitude of divinity. Amid the chaos, betrayal rippled through the Pantheon. Ares, his fury uncontained, struck at Zeus with devastating force, lightning meeting fire in a clash that shook entire systems. Poseidon, misinterpreting the conflict, unleashed tidal forces indiscriminately, drowning fleets and destroying planets that had been allied with no one. Even Athena, for all her intellect, found her calculations strained as the unexpected actions of her siblings forced her to improvise, bending her strategies in real time to preserve her advantage. The gods' unity, tenuous at best, disintegrated entirely, leaving them vulnerable to the subtle manipulations of mortals who had learned to exploit every flaw, every moment of divine arrogance. Hades moved silently through this maelstrom, observing and calculating. He did not intervene directly, but whispers of doubt, fear, and betrayal flowed into the minds of each god, amplifying tensions and feeding the chaos. For the first time, even beings born of the warp experienced hesitation, uncertainty, and distraction. Mortals seized upon this opportunity, coordinating fleets, launching psychic strikes, and exploiting the cracks in divine command. Every action, every sacrifice, slowly shifted the balance, proving that even the mightiest beings could be challenged when arrogance and rivalry left them exposed. The first heroes emerged from the madness. Psychers, trained to navigate the warp without succumbing to madness, acted as beacons of defiance. Admirals risked entire fleets to lure gods into traps, exploiting the predictability of their pride and fury. Soldiers, hardened by centuries of war, faced psychic storms with fearless determination, learning to anticipate divine movements, and survive where survival seemed impossible. In this convergence, humanity was no longer a passive witness. They had become active participants in a war for the very structure of reality. Yet the cost was staggering. Entire planets were reduced to rubble, trillions of lives lost, and the fabric of the warp itself warped under the intensity of psychic energy. Mortals fought not only for survival, but to prevent the gods from reshaping the universe according to their own whims. The line between creation and destruction blurred as battles unfolded across multiple planes of existence simultaneously. Fleets clashing in real space, psychic duels waging in the warp, and entire worlds caught in the eye of divine storms. As the convergence reached its zenith, it became painfully clear that the outcome would not be determined by raw power alone. The mortals' resilience, ingenuity, and ability to exploit the gods' weaknesses were now pivotal. For the first time, the gods faced the terrifying realization that their might, born of the infinite chaos of the warp, could be matched, and perhaps even overcome, by beings they had long considered insignificant. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, where every choice, every act of courage, and every betrayal could reshape not only the galaxy, but the very laws of reality itself. The sky of Central Sector burned with psychic fire. Worlds quaked beneath the force of divine conflict, their surfaces split by lightning, fire, and tidal surges that no technology could withstand. Zeus and Ares clashed above a shattered planet, a storm of fury and rage that twisted the orbit of moons and ignited the atmosphere. Entire fleets hovered beneath them, powerless to intervene directly, yet mortals acted where they could, using cunning and precision to exploit even the smallest openings in divine movements. Every bolt of lightning, every swing of a spectral sword, created tremors that rippled through both reality and the warp itself. Athena maneuvered with terrifying efficiency, guiding imperial fleets and psychers to outthink and outmaneuver gods whose pride had blinded them. Her strategies forced Poseidon's tidal currents into deadly collisions with Zeus' storms, weakening both, while subtle psychic attacks disrupted Ares' legions from within. Mortals had become the unseen hand, bending the pantheon's rivalry to their advantage. Even the god of death, Hades, found his whispers countered by human bravery and defiance. Mortals were no longer passive. They were catalysts, shaping the battlefield as much as the gods themselves. Yet the cost was unimaginable. Entire star systems were erased in a single clash, their populations vaporized, cities reduced to molten ruins, and warp storms leaving lingering scars on reality itself. Psychers screamed as the psychic currents of multiple gods collided, risking sanity and life alike. Starships were crushed beneath tidal waves of psychic energy, or shredded by bolts of lightning that bent the laws of physics. The galaxy teetered on the edge of annihilation, yet the courage of mortals shone brighter than ever in the storm of divine fury. Amid this chaos, betrayals among the gods escalated. Ares, blinded by rage, struck at Zeus with ferocity, ignoring Athena's subtle manipulations that sought to guide him elsewhere. Poseidon, enraged by the unpredictable movements of the other gods, unleashed tidal surges that devastated friend and foe alike. Even Athena's careful orchestration faltered as the unpredictable actions of her siblings forced her to improvise, revealing that even intellect alone could not dominate the battlefield. Hades' whispers twisted into outright deception, stoking paranoia and mistrust among the gods themselves. Mortals seized upon this disarray. Rogue psychers created psychic mirrors, reflecting divine attacks back upon their sources. Admirals baited gods into overextending, forcing their might to consume itself. Soldiers risked everything to strike at critical points, exploiting weaknesses that only human ingenuity could detect. Each act of courage, each calculated risk, eroded the seemingly absolute power of the Pantheon, proving that even beings forged from the infinite chaos of the warp were not invincible. As the battle reached its zenith, the universe itself trembled. Stars flared and dimmed, planets were reshaped or annihilated, and the fabric of reality writhed under the clash of mortals and gods. In this maelstrom of destruction, the galaxy realized the horrifying truth. The outcome would not be determined by strength alone, nor by cunning alone, but by the interplay of both mortal resilience and divine flaw. The first decisive phase of the war had begun, and the consequences would echo across the universe for millennia. Amid the swirling chaos of lightning, fire, and tidal psychic energy, a moment of extraordinary clarity emerged. Mortals, battered and bleeding, had discovered a strategy that leveraged not brute force, but the gods' own flaws against them. A coalition of psychers, admirals, and soldiers executed a coordinated strike designed to disrupt the divine flow of power itself. Zeus, distracted by Ares' relentless assaults, was caught off guard as psychic anchors, artifacts of human ingenuity attuned to the warp, sapped portions of his lightning, feeding feedback through the currents that threatened to destabilize him. Ares, consumed by fury and betrayal, fell into a trap meticulously orchestrated by Athena. His spectral legions, meant to dominate battlefields, were redirected by psychic illusions, turning allies against each other in a bloody, chaotic spiral. For the first time, the god of war experienced the vulnerability of unpredictability, a variable that even his rage could not fully control. Mortals, tiny yet fearless, watched as the indomitable Ares was momentarily ensnared by their cunning, proving that knowledge and strategy could bend even divine fury. Poseidon's tidal assaults were undermined by precise countermeasures. Sacrificial fleets, guided by rogue traders and psychers, redirected the gods' surging oceans into carefully calculated channels. Entire planetary surfaces that had been doomed were spared, and fleets that should have been annihilated survived intact. Poseidon, enraged and frustrated, realized that the mortals had learned the rhythm of his power and were exploiting it with terrifying efficiency. His tidal might, which had seemed unstoppable, faltered under the ingenuity of those he had considered insignificant. Even Hades, patient and cunning, faced unexpected resistance. Mortals refused to succumb to fear. Instead, they confronted death with deliberate bravery. Psychers reflected his whispers back, and soldiers acted with resolve in the face of despair. The god of shadows, who had long thrived on inevitability, discovered that courage could disrupt the chain of control he wielded so effortlessly. The realization was subtle but profound. Mortals were no longer pawns, they were active agents of change in a conflict that had seemed hopeless. The first major triumph of humanity was achieved not through overwhelming force, but through strategy, courage, and sacrifice. Entire sectors were stabilized, gods weakened, and mortal morale surged. The Pantheon, powerful beyond imagination, had been forced to adapt, showing cracks in both unity and omnipotence. The galaxy, scarred and battered, glimpsed the possibility that even beings born from the infinite chaos of the warp could be resisted. Mortals had learned a terrifying truth, that courage, cunning, and unity could carve paths of hope through even the darkest storms of divinity. Yet the victory came at an immense cost. Worlds were shattered, trillions of lives lost, and the warp itself still roiled with the fury of the Pantheon. The gods, now fully aware of mortal potential, would retaliate with unprecedented force. The war was far from over. It had only entered a more dangerous phase, where every act of defiance could invite annihilation. and every triumph was tempered by the awareness that these beings of unimaginable power would not forgive or forget. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a final clash where the fate of the galaxy, and perhaps reality itself, would be decided. The galaxy braced itself as the Pantheon, humiliated yet unbroken, prepared to unleash their full fury. Zeus' storms now burned with twice their previous intensity, each lightning strike a weapon of unparalleled devastation. Ares, his fury sharpened by previous defeats, commanded spectral legions with ruthless precision, striking at both mortals and rival gods alike. Poseidon's tidal forces surged uncontrollably, reshaping planets into psychic battlegrounds, while Athena orchestrated chaos with unerring intelligence, her strategies bending reality to her will. Hades, silent and calculating, prepared to exploit every hesitation, every fear, every shred of doubt. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of existence. Mortals, aware that survival required more than defiance, marshaled their full ingenuity. Psychers and technomancers worked in unison, creating devices and psychic constructs that could interact with the divine currents of the warp. Admirals coordinated fleets with precision that bordered on preternatural, predicting godly movements and exploiting even subtle weaknesses. Soldiers, hardened by centuries of war, acted with fearless resolve, their actions shaping outcomes that even gods had not foreseen. The galaxy's fate rested not on the strength of mortals, but on their capacity to outthink, outmaneuver, and endure. The first wave of confrontation tore through the central sector. Zeus' lightning struck, shattering planetary defenses and incinerating fleets. Yet human ingenuity redirected some of the energy back upon him. Feedback ripples coursed through his form, weakening the god for a fleeting instant, a moment seized by mortals to launch coordinated strikes. Ares, sensing interference, raged uncontrollably, yet his predictable fury became a weapon in the hands of mortals who had learned his patterns. Poseidon's tidal onslaughts collided with Athena's intricate manipulations, creating a maelstrom of psychic chaos that even the gods struggled to control. Hades, ever patient, moved in the shadows. His whispers now encountered resistance, his subtle manipulations countered by the steadfast courage of human psychers and soldiers alike. Worlds once lost to despair remained defiant, their populations refusing to bend to inevitability. Mortals were no longer merely surviving, they were shaping the course of a war fought across the stars, in the void, and within the very currents of the warp itself. As the battle escalated, cracks among the gods widened. Rivalries, pride, and frustration erupted into open conflict, their combined might fracturing under the strain of both internal discord and mortal resistance. Zeus and Ares clashed repeatedly, their fury consuming the surrounding sectors. Poseidon's tides, thrown into disarray, collided with Athena's carefully orchestrated psychic fields. Even Hades' mastery of fear faltered as humans faced death without surrender, their courage reflecting his whispers back upon him in a storm of defiance. The first decisive turning point arrived when mortals, exploiting the gods' fractures, coordinated a strike that combined courage, cunning, and sacrifice. Entire fleets acted as psychic amplifiers, focusing energy into critical points that destabilized the Pantheon's forms. Worlds were shattered, yes, and billions perished. Yet the gods themselves were forced to contend with their own imperfections. For the first time, beings born from the infinite chaos of the warp were forced to adapt, to hesitate, to reconsider. Mortals had learned to strike not with strength, but with precision, using the gods' own flaws as weapons, a revelation that would determine the fate of the galaxy.